The Terror by Arthur Machen. Chapter 1. The Coming of the Terror. After 2 years, we are turning once more to the morning's news with a sense of appetite and glad expectation. There were thrills at the beginning of the war, the thrill of horror and of a doom that seemed at once incredible and certain. This was when Namur fell, and the German host swelled like a flood over the French fields, and drew very near to the walls of Paris. Then we felt the thrill of exultation when the good news came that the awful tide had been turned back, that Paris and the world were safe, for a while at all events. Then for days we hoped for more news as good as this or better. Has von Muck been surrounded? Not today, but perhaps he'll be surrounded tomorrow. But the days became weeks, and the weeks drew out to months. The battle in the West seemed frozen. Now and again things were done that seemed hopeful, with promise of events still better. But Neuve-Chapelle and Loos dwindled into disappointments as their tale was told fully. The lines in the West remained, for all practical purposes of victory, immobile. Nothing seemed to happen. There was nothing to read save the record of operations that were clearly trifling and insignificant. People speculated as to the reason of this inaction. The hopeful said that Joffre had a plan, that he was nibbling. Others declared that we were short of munitions. Others again said that the new levies were not yet ripe for battle. So the months went by, and almost 2 years of war had been completed before the motionless English line began to stir and quiver as if it awoke from a long sleep, and began to roll onward, overwhelming the enemy. The secret of the long inaction of the British armies had been well kept. On the one hand, it was rigorously protected by the censorship, which severe, and sometimes severe to the point of absurdity, the captains and the redacted depart, for instance, became in this particular matter ferocious. As soon as the real significance of that which was happening, of beginning to happen, was perceived by the authorities, an underlined circular was issued to the newspaper proprietors of Great Britain and Ireland. It warned each proprietor that he might impart the contents of this circular to one other person only, such person being the responsible editor of his paper, who was to keep the communication secret under the severest penalties. The circular forbade any mention of certain events that had taken place, that might take place. It forbade any kind of allusion to these events, or any hint of their existence, or of the possibility of their existence, not only in the press, but in any form whatever. The subject was not to be alluded to in conversation. It was not to be hinted at, however obscurely, in letters. The very existence of the circular, its subject apart, was to be a dead secret. These measures were successful. A wealthy newspaper proprietor of the North warmed a little at the end of the Throwsters' feast, which was held, as usual, it will be remembered, ventured to say to the man next to him, "How awful it would be, wouldn't it, if—" His words were repeated, as proof, one regrets to say, that it was time for old Arnold to pull himself together, and he was fined £1,000. Then there was the case of an obscure weekly paper published in the county town of an agricultural district in Wales. The Maros Observer, we will call it, was issued from a stationer's back premises, and filled its 4 pages with accounts of local flower shows, fancy fairs at vicarages, reports of parish councils, and rare bathing fatalities. It also issued a visitors' list, which has been known to contain 6 names. This enlightened organ printed a paragraph, which nobody noticed, which was very like paragraphs that small country newspapers have long been in the habit of printing, which could hardly give so much as a hint to anyone, that is, who was not fully instructed in the secret. As a matter of fact, this piece of intelligence got into the paper because the proprietor, who was also the editor, incautiously left the last processes of this particular issue to the staff, who is the Lord High Everything Else of the establishment. And the staff put in a bit of gossip he had heard in the market to fill up 2 inches on the back page. But the result was that the morose observer ceased to appear, owing to untoward circumstances, as the proprietor said, and he would say no more. No more, that is, by way of explanation, but a great deal more by way of execration of damned prying busybodies. Now a censorship that is sufficiently minute and utterly remorseless can do amazing things in the way of hiding what it wants to hide. Before the war, one would have thought otherwise. One would have said that, censor or no censor, the fact of the murder at X, or the fact of the bank robbery at Y, would certainly become known, if not through the press, at all events through rumor and the passage of the news from mouth to mouth. And this would be true of England 300 years ago, and of savage tribe lands of today. But we have grown of late to such a reverence for the printed word, and such a reliance on it, that the old faculty of disseminating news by word of mouth has become atrophied. Forbid the press to mention the fact that Jones has been murdered, and it is marvelous how few people will hear of it. And of those who hear, how few will credit the story that they have heard. You meet a man in the train who remarks that he has been told something about a murder in Southwark. There is all the difference in the world between the impression you receive from such a chance communication and that given by half a dozen lines of print with name and street and date and all the facts of the case. People in trains repeat all sorts of tales, many of them false. Newspapers do not print accounts of murders that have not been committed. Then another consideration that has made for secrecy. I may have seemed to say that the old office of rumor no longer exists. I shall be reminded of the strange legend of the Russians and the mythology of the angels of Mons. But let me point out, in the first place, that both these absurdities depended on the papers for their wide dissemination. If there had been no newspapers or magazines, Russians and angels would have made but a brief, vague appearance of the most shadowy kind. A few would have heard of them. Fewer still would have believed in them. They would have been gossiped about for a bare week or 2, and so they would have vanished away. And then again, the very fact of these vain rumors and fantastic tales having been so widely believed for a time was fatal to the credit of any stray mutterings that may have got abroad. People had been taken in twice. They had seen how grave persons, men of credit, had preached and lectured about the shining forms that had saved the British Army at Mons, or had testified to the trains, packed with grey-coated Muscovites, rushing through the land at dead of night. And now there was a hint of something more amazing than either of the discredited legends. But this time there was no word of confirmation to be found in daily paper or weekly review or parish magazine, and so the few that heard either laughed or, being serious, went home and jotted down notes for essays on wartime psychology, collective delusions. I followed neither of these courses, for before the secret circular had been issued, my curiosity had somehow been aroused by certain paragraphs concerning a fatal accident to well-known airmen. The propeller of the aeroplane had been shattered, apparently by a collision with the flight of pigeons. The blades had been broken, and the machine had fallen like lead to the earth. And soon after I had seen this account, I heard of some very odd circumstances relating to an explosion in a great munition factory in the Midlands. I thought I saw the possibility of a connection between the two very different events. It has been pointed out to me by friends who have been good enough to read this record that certain phrases I have used may give the impression that I ascribe all the delays of the war on the Western Front to the extraordinary circumstances which occasioned the issue of the secret circular. Of course this is not the case, there were many reasons for the immobility of our lines from October 1914 to July 1916. These causes have been evident enough and have been openly discussed and deplored. But behind them was something of infinitely greater moment. We lacked men, but men were pouring into the new army. We were short of shells, but when the shortage was proclaimed, the nation set itself to mend this matter with all its energy. We could undertake to supply the defects of our army, both in men and munitions, if the new and incredible danger could be overcome. It has been overcome. Rather, perhaps, it has ceased to exist, and the secret may now be told. I have said my attention was attracted by an account of the death of a well-known airman. I have not the habit of preserving cuttings, I am sorry to say, so that I cannot be precise as to the date of this event. To the best of my belief, it was either towards the end of May or the beginning of June 1915. The newspaper paragraph announcing the death of Flight Lieutenant Western-Reynolds was brief enough. Accidents and fatal accidents to the men who are storming the air for us are, unfortunately, by no means so rare as to demand an elaborated notice. But the manner in which Western-Reynolds met his death struck me as extraordinary, inasmuch as it revealed a new danger in the element that we have lately conquered. He was brought down, as I have said, by a flight of birds, of pigeons, as appeared by what was found on the blood-stained and shattered blades of the propeller. An eyewitness of the accident, a fellow officer, described how Western-Reynolds set out from the aerodrome on a fine afternoon, there being hardly any wind. He was going to France. He had made the journey to and fro half a dozen times or more, and felt perfectly secure and at ease. Wester rose to a great height at once, and we could scarcely see the machine. I was turning to go when one of the fellows called out, "I say, what's this?" He pointed up, and we saw what looked like a black cloud coming from the south at a tremendous rate. I saw at once it wasn't a cloud. It came with a swirl and a rush quite different from any cloud I've ever seen. But for a second I couldn't make out exactly what it was. It altered its shape and turned into a great crescent, and wheeled and veered about as if it were looking for something. The man who had called out had got his glasses, and was staring for all he was worth. Then he shouted that it was a tremendous flight of birds, thousands of them. They went on wheeling and beating about high up in the air, and we were watching them, thinking it was interesting, but not supposing that they would make any difference to Wester, who was just about out of sight. His machine was just a speck. Then the two arms of the crescent drew in as quick as lightning, and these thousands of birds shot in a solid mass right up there across the sky and flew away somewhere about northwest. Then Henley, the man with the glasses, called out, "He's down!" and started running, and I went after him. We got a car, and as we were going along, Henley told me that he'd seen the machine drop dead, as if it came out of that cloud of birds. He thought then that they must have mucked up the propeller somehow. That turned out to be the case. We found the propeller blades all broken and covered with blood and pigeon feathers, and carcasses of the birds had got wedged in between the blades and were sticking to them. This was the story that the young airman told one evening in a small company. He did not speak in confidence, so I have no hesitation in reproducing what he said. Naturally, I did not take a verbatim note of his conversation, but I have something of a knack of remembering talk that interests me, and I think my reproduction is very near to the tale that I heard. And let it be noted that the flying man told his story without any sense or indication of a sense that the incredible, or all but the incredible, had happened. So far as he knew, he said, it was the first accident of the kind. Airmen in France had been bothered once or twice by birds. He thought they were eagles, flying viciously at them, but poor old Wester had been the first man to come up against a flight of some thousands of pigeons. And perhaps I shall be next, he added, but why look for trouble? Anyhow, I'm going to see Toodaloo tomorrow afternoon. Well, I heard this story as one hears all the varied marvels and terrors of the air, as one heard some years ago of air pockets, strange gulfs or voids in the atmosphere into which airmen fell with great peril, or as one heard of the experience of the airman who flew over the Cumberland Mountains in a burning summer of 1911, and as he swam far above the heights, was suddenly and vehemently blown upwards, the hot air from the rocks striking his plane as if it had been a blast from a furnace chimney. We have just begun to navigate a strange region. We must expect to encounter strange adventures, strange perils. And here a new chapter in the chronicles of these perils and adventures had been opened by the death of Western-Reynolds, and no doubt invention and contrivance would presently hit on some way of countering the new danger. It was, I think, about a week or 10 days after the airman's death that my business called me to a northern town, the name of which, perhaps, had better remain unknown. My mission was to inquire into certain charges of extravagance which had been laid against the working people, that is, the munition workers of this especial town. It was said that the men who used to earn £2 10 shillings a week were now getting from £7 to £8, that bits of girls were being paid £2 instead of 7 or 8 shillings, and that, in consequence, there was an orgy of foolish extravagance. The girls, I was told, were eating chocolate at 4, 5, and 6 shillings a pound. The women were ordering £30 pianos, which they couldn't play, and the men bought gold chains at 10 and 20 guineas apiece. I dived into the town in question and found, as usual, that there was a mixture of truth and exaggeration in the stories that I had heard. Gramophones, for example, they cannot be called in strictness necessaries, but they were undoubtedly finding a ready sale, even in the more expensive brands, and I thought that there were a great many very spick-and-span perambulators to be seen on the pavement, smart perambulators, painted in tender shades of color and expensively fitted. And how can you be surprised if people will have a bit of a fling? A worker said to me, "We're seeing money for the first time in our lives, and it's bright, and we work hard for it, and we risk our lives to get it. You've heard of explosion yonder." He mentioned certain works on the outskirts of the town. Of course, neither the name of the works nor of the town had been printed. There had been a brief notice of explosion at munition works in the northern district, many fatalities. The working man told me about it, and added some dreadful details. They wouldn't let their folks see bodies, screwed them up in coffins as they found them in shop. The gas had done it. Turned their faces black, you mean? Nay, they were all as if they had been bitten to pieces. This was a strange gas. I asked the man in the northern town all sorts of questions about the extraordinary explosion of which he had spoken to me, but he had very little more to say. As I have noted already, secrets that may not be printed are often deeply kept. Last summer, there were very few people outside high official circles who knew anything about the tanks of which we have all been talking lately, though these strange instruments of war were being exercised and tested in a park not far from London. So the man who told me of the explosion in the munition factory was most likely genuine in his profession that he knew nothing more of the disaster. I found out that he was a smelter employed at a furnace on the other side of town to the ruined factory. He didn't know even what they had been making there, some very dangerous high explosive, he supposed. His information was really nothing more than a bit of gruesome gossip, which he had heard probably at third or fourth or fifth hand. The horrible detail of faces, as if they had been bitten to pieces, had made its violent impression on him. That was all. I gave him up and took a tram to the district of the disaster, a sort of industrial suburb 5 miles from the center of town. When I asked for the factory, I was told that it was no good my going to it, as there was nobody there. But I found it, a raw and hideous shed with a walled yard about it and a shut gate. I looked for signs of destruction, but there was nothing. The roof was quite undamaged, and again it struck me that this had been a strange accident. There had been an explosion of sufficient violence to kill workpeople in the building, but the building itself showed no wounds or scars. A man came out of the gate and locked it behind him. I began to ask him some sort of question, or rather, I began to open for a question with, "A terrible business here, they tell me," or some such phrase of convention. I got no farther. The man asked me if I saw a policeman walking down the street. I said I did, and I was given the choice of getting about my business forthwith, or of being instantly given in charge as a spy. "Thou'st better be gone and quick about it," was, I think, his final advice, and I took it. Well, I had come literally up against a brick wall. Thinking the problem over, I could only suppose that the smelter or his informant had twisted the phrases of the story. The smelter had said the dead men's faces were bitten to pieces. This might be an unconscious perversion of eaten away. That phrase might describe well enough the effect of strong acids, and, for all I knew of the processes of munition making, such acids might be used and might explode with horrible results in some perilous stage of their admixture. It was a day or two later that the accident to the airman, Western-Reynolds, came into my mind. For one of those instants, which are far shorter than any measure of time, there flashed out the possibility of a link between the two disasters. But here was a wild impossibility, and I drove it away. And yet I think that the thought, mad as it seemed, never left me. It was the secret light that at last guided me through a somber grove of enigmas. It was about this time, so far as the date can be fixed, that the whole district, one might say the whole county, was visited by a series of extraordinary and terrible calamities, which were the more terrible inasmuch as they continued for some time to be inscrutable mysteries. It is indeed doubtful whether these awful events do not still remain mysteries to many of those concerned. For before the inhabitants of this part of the country had time to join one link of evidence to another, the circular was issued, and thenceforth no one knew how to distinguish undoubted fact from wild and extravagant surmise. The district in question is in the far west of Wales. I shall call it, for convenience, Marion. In it there is one seaside town of some repute with holiday-makers for 5 or 6 weeks in the summer, and dotted about the country there are 3 or 4 small old towns that seem drooping in a slow decay, sleepy and grey with age and forgetfulness. They remind me of what I have read of towns in the west of Ireland. Grass grows between the uneven stones of the pavements. The signs above the shop windows decline. Half the letters of these signs are missing. Here and there a house has been pulled down, or has been allowed to slide into ruin, and wild greenery springs up through the fallen stones, and there is silence in all the streets. And it is to be noted, these are not places that were once magnificent. The Celts have never had the art of building, and so far as I can see, such towns as Towie and Merthyr Tegveth and Miros must have been always much as they are now, clusters of poorish, meanly built houses, ill-kept and down at heel. And these few towns are thinly scattered over a wild country, where north is divided from south by a wilder mountain range. One of these places is 16 miles from any station. The others are doubtfully and deviously connected by single-line railways served by rare trains that pause and stagger and hesitate on their slow journey up mountain passes, or stop for half an hour or more at lonely sheds called stations, situated in the midst of desolate marshes. A few years ago I travelled with an Irishman on one of these queer lines, and he looked to right and saw the bog with its yellow and blue grasses and stagnant pools, and he looked to left and saw a ragged hillside set with grey stone walls. "I can hardly believe," he said, "that I am not still in the wilds of Ireland." Here, then, one sees a wild and divided and scattered region, a land of outland hills and secret and hidden valleys. I know white farms on this coast which must be separated by 2 hours of hard, rough walking from any other habitation, which are invisible from any other house. And inland, again, the farms are often ringed about by thick groves of ash, planted by men of old days to shelter their roof trees from rude winds of the mountain and stormy winds of the sea, so that these places, too, are hidden away, to be surmised only by the wood smoke that rises from the green surrounding leaves. A Londoner must see them to believe them, and even then he can scarcely credit their utter isolation. Such, then, in the main, is Marion, and on this land, in the early summer of the last year, terror descended, a terror without shape, such as no man there had ever known. It began with the tale of a little child who wandered out into the lanes to pick flowers one sunny afternoon, and never came back to the cottage on the hill.